So we're going to read the Word of God. It's 1 Samuel and chapter 8. 1 Samuel and chapter 8, commencing to read at verse 1. One Samuel 8 and verse 1. And it came to pass when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And he said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands, and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed or repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, Go ye every man unto his city. May God bless his word to our hearts this morning. I want us to pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, whenever we have been studying the life of the prophet Samuel. And we have covered how the Samuel held 3 offices in the work of God. It was very, very important to hold those offices as far as Samuel went. But where we left off 2 weeks ago was that Samuel is now an old man. And Samuel did something that really history repeated itself. We have covered how Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, as to how their lives were ended, as to how Phinehas' wife went into labour, and she brought forth a man-child called Ichabod, which simply meant the glory of God had departed from Israel. Eli the priest has fallen back. He has broken his neck. His 2 sons are now in eternity, and we find that the glory of God is departed from Israel. 2 weeks ago we looked at how that he appointed his 2 sons, Abiah and Joel, to take over the leadership from the father. That was absolute disaster. They were the worst people that could ever have been placed into leadership, and it was going to cost very dearly. These young men, Joel and Abijah, we're told. There were very spiritual names, they had great spiritual meaning. But the people come and they say to Samuel, look, your sons are vile, they take bribes, they're doing all sorts of things, they're not fit to be our rulers. And what we want now is we want you to appoint a king that will rule over us. And we have already covered as to how that king was going to go out and help in the fighting of the battles. There was going to be this leadership that was provided, but it was never, ever God's intention. I want us to look at the subject this morning of leadership. And I wanted us to look at this subject in the light of the prophet Samuel and what we can learn from him whenever Samuel said 6 times, he says, if you really want a king, God has said you ought to have a king, but it's going to cost you dearly. And 6 times we read those words, take, take, take. And we'll come back to them a little later on as to what all it was going to cost. In chapter 7, we return to the Israelites. It has been nearly 21 years since Shiloh has been demolished, since Eli and his sons were killed, and since the Philistines asserted themselves, and the ark of God was taken into captivity. Now we find the ark is within a year is brought back, but things were far from good in Israel. I want you to notice, by way of introduction, there was no Shiloh, there was no priesthood. The Philistines may have given back the ark, but they hadn't left Israel alone. There were many in Israel who felt that God had abandoned his people, but for 20 years Samuel keeps preaching. And as Samuel preaches for 20 years, that's a long time to preach. Very, very slowly but surely, the people start to respond to the Word of God. And they start to listen. Samuel's point to the people was they need to choose who they're going to serve. Either the Baal worshippers, the Ashtaroths, and God, but they cannot have all this mixture. They're going to have to make a choice as to who they're going to serve. I want you to notice, dear friends, that leadership is very important to God. Leadership is something that is desperately lacking in our land today. And I want to start with the family. Leadership is lacking desperately within the family. Desperately. I was at a wake the other night. I make reference to it in our Gazette whenever we were printing it yesterday. I was at the wake of Pastor Smith. And Pastor Smith, the late Pastor Smith, who went to be with the Lord on Thursday, he shared with me many years ago, whenever he was helping out at my mother's funeral, which my mother is 15 years dead, next month. Pastor Smith told me back then, he said how that the pastorate was much more difficult today than it was whenever he came as a young man. And we were working it out, he must have only been in his 20s, whenever he came to Nakane, near Ballygolly. And one of the reasons he reckoned was the breakdown of the family. And I want to say that we've been here over 30 years now, and I'm sure that no matter how long someone is in the work of God, they realize that leadership is something that is desperately lacking. You do not have fathers now. You have many homes without fathers. You have many homes today without mothers. You have homes today where children decide whether they want to go to church, whether to go to Sunday school. And what do we find is the children that make the decisions rather than the parents. Leadership was of vital importance in the days that we read about. I want to say that whether it's in the family, whether it's in the Lord's work, whether it's in the pastorate, whether it's in youth work, whether it's in Sunday school, leadership is of vital importance. And God is interested in leadership. And I want you to notice that for the first 3 generations, the father was always the leader. You read about Abraham, you read about Isaac, and you read about Jacob. But the moment that the family, and I realised that in the East there was the extended family, But the moment that the family reached clan size, which was around 70, there was a need to have an appointed leader. Somebody that was going to oversee things. And long before Jacob died, God had promised a new leader, and that leader was going to be Joseph. Joseph is still a teenager, but God made it very obvious that he was going to be the next leader of the clan. And against all the odds, Joseph became the leader. I want you to notice that in Joseph, we see the marks of a good leader. Now, I've covered this before, that whenever I decided to do A-level psychology many years ago, that there was one word that was used to describe what a leader must be. And I suppose that we can look at the leader in the home, we can look at the leader in the work of God, you look at the leader in the workplace, whoever your boss is, whoever your overseer is, and that one word was adaptability, where someone is able to adapt very quickly to changing circumstances. You imagine if you go in to visit someone, if you're in the ministry, and you go in to visit somebody in the hospital, as I have. I sat the other day in the hospital, and I must honestly say, all around me on the floor, there was nothing but vomit on the floor. That as I sat and visited, I had to watch exactly where I placed my shoes. Now, I suppose it's a lack of staff. The girls that were working in the hospital, they were rather busy. But you imagine what you would face if you said, well, I don't like these circumstances. I don't like being in this here. Well, it would be very poor. I know of those that don't like blood. I don't either. There's many things in life that we don't like, but we have to face. We have to adapt to. Now, Joseph knew that God was preparing him, that he would save his people through the awful famine. God was working and God was preparing. The second thing about leadership is that it's all about serving, and sometimes at a considerable cost to himself. It cost Joseph. You see, there's something badly wrong whenever a leader only thinks of himself and what he can get out of the job rather than what he gives. I'll say that even whenever it comes to the family. I'll say that whenever it comes to any circumstances, that if it's only about what we can get out of it. There's many fathers today roam. Many fathers. You have the child support agency that tries to chase them up and all the rest of it. But who shun their responsibility. Now, after Joseph's death, as people lived in Egypt, they were very well off, they were secure, but then things began to turn for the worse. And the Egyptians started to abuse their guests and turn them into cheap labour. And then one day they cried to God, and God heard their cries. And He gave them a leader in Moses. Now Moses is only, he's a young man really. He's 40 years of age or thereabouts. He's described as well educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was powerful in speech and action, the word tells us. But God gave to the children of Israel this leader in Moses. Then we're told the children of Israel, they settled in the promised land, and history repeats itself. They cry to God for help, and each time without fail, God sent them a leader. I was in a very good prayer meeting on Monday night where we were praying over in Dungannon that God would send leaders into the work of God. That God would release young men, older men for that matter, from even secular things. And I believed the other night, as I left the prayer meeting in Dungannon, that God has answered prayer. I don't know where. I don't know where the signs are. But I believe whenever God's people pray, that because the work of God is crying out for leaders. And of course, we have been reminded, we're only too conscious of it, that for many of us, even in our own fellowship, that the years are clocking up, and the time will come whenever a new leader will need to be appointed in many, even of our own churches. And so, God sent His people a leader. In the Old Testament, He sent many good leaders. There was Othniel, there was Ehud. We have looked at them in the past whenever we covered our series in the Judges. There was Gideon, there was Jephthah, there was Samson, and they all took up this leadership, and some of it was a tremendous personal cost. But they were used of God to save God's people from one peril or another. Those people were known as the Judges. The point that I really want to make today is that God never failed to send a leader. It is not just that the people needed a leader, but God wanted his people under good leadership. And Samuel was the leader of the same order. After the fall of Shiloh, he could have quietly gone off into retirement and lived a nice, quiet kind of a life, but that wasn't what God wanted Samuel to do. And at a tremendous cost to himself, he gave his life to being a leader. Whenever the Philistines launched their attack at Mizpah, he showed what kind of a leader that he was. God used him to save his people again. Now in chapter 8, Samuel's an old man. Now he's going to get a number of years after this. God wasn't about to take Samuel of the scene. But we're told that Samuel's old, and he sees that leadership's needed, and so he decides that he will appoint his own sons to be the leader. Soon the people were coming out from under his leadership and protection, and so he didn't want this vacuum at the top, and he appointed his sons. Now, no one maybe seemed to be that happy about it. And Samuel, he responds to the situation, and he appoints his sons. The Israelites come and they say, but your sons are not good. Your sons are taking bribes. Your sons are not walking in your ways. Your sons have perverted judgment. They're after lucre. They're after money. They're in it for the wrong reasons. And so we want the leadership of a king. Now, I would say that his two sons were probably the most useless leaders that ever could have been around. You know, that tells me something. It tells me that we assume that there was nothing wrong with the fathering skills of Samuel. I'm sure in the story of the prodigal son, we also assume there was nothing wrong with the fathering skills even of the prodigal's father. The son decided to leave there in Luke's Gospel. But good leadership is all about giving. But leadership as far as Joel and Abijah went, it was all about getting. What was the perks of office? What was in it for them? Leadership for them meant an opportunity to rip off the people under their authority. Now, Samuel's sons, I want you to get it, were not in the same league as their father. And I've repeated it over and over again. And I mean it. I mean it, dear friends. That as I read the Scriptures, good fathers sometimes reared bad sons. And vice versa. The same whenever it came to mothers. Very often evil mothers reared good daughters. And so it reminds me that salvation does not run in the blood. Being a good parent doesn't guarantee that your children will turn out fine. Far from it at times. The elders of Israel have been giving this matter some thought, and they conclude that the best way forward is they need a king. Now Samuel responds. In verse 6 we're told, the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us, and Samuel prayed unto the Lord. They're saying, look Samuel, you've served us for many years. Your day of serving us is over. You're now old. We want a king just like the other nations. You see, dear friends, as we look at Samuel was dumbfounded. They want a king. But they've already got a king. God was their king. They didn't need the earthly king. God was already their king. God is their king, and what God does is to provide them with leaders that God has always answered, and He has given to them leaders down through the history. But these people want something more secure than simply waiting for God to appoint their leaders. They want a monarchy. And they want this system in which they never have to trust God for the next leader, that it will be constantly passed down. Well, if you look at history, wasn't it true that even our Queen, and I've always made no bones about it, I'm afraid I've never been a royalist. And you can stone me for that, but I've never been. And mind you, I think even after these last while, it convinces me I'm just not there. And I know that everybody has their own views and ideas, and that's fine. But I personally, well, I'm not a royalist. I'm not. Now, my wife loves to read about old Victoria and go right back and all the rest of it, but I'm afraid I'm just not. Sometimes my wife will remind me, she said, well, you were brought up way over there at Ballygawley. I was brought up where I listened to the big drums beat and all the rest of it. But well, everybody to their own. Now, their anxieties about the future, they were well founded. There was going to be many trials out there, and they feel they need this leader. But we've already covered the stone Ebenezer. And it should have been a reminder that God was with them, that He was their king, that they didn't need an earthly king. You see, dear friends, today, it's all about leadership. I want you to notice today that with leadership, there's responsibilities. And if we do not see our responsibilities whenever it comes to leadership, then we're better not in leadership. No, I'm not saying this. I'm not going behind anybody's back to say it. But I often do. Thank God for the board that we've got in the church here. Because they're always there. I expect that, of course, unless there's something crops up. I mentioned the other night with Mrs. Leonard, our church secretary in hospital. I suppose it's true to say that was only her second meeting to miss in 30 years. So that's not bad. That's not bad. But with leadership, there is responsibilities. Now, the best way to be a good leader, and whatever role we're in, is by example. That's the best way to lead, is by example. You see, if I was to tell children in Sunday school, if I was to sing in Sunday school, oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see, and what little hands, what you do, and little feet, where you go. But I'm not careful. Will those children be interested in what I say? Not really. They'll be more interested in what I do. If I teach children that it's very important to come out to the house of God, it's very important to pray, it's very important to do these things, but I as a leader don't do those things, I would be a very bad example of a leader. You see, I knew of a church not that far from here, and one day, many years ago, they decided that they would call a new rector. And this new rector professed salvation, and inside the church there was a little band, and I know some of the people, and they had a prayer meeting. And they said to the rector, look, we think that we should start a prayer meeting. And the rector said, well, I tried that in my previous church. It didn't work. And so he left it to the people, well, if you want a wee prayer meeting, you have a wee prayer meeting. But they told me themselves that nearly the first night of the prayer meeting, the rector cut the grass. Well, his people were at prayer. Now, what does that tell me? It tells me that there's a man and he has absolutely no interest in prayer. It'll not matter how much time he spends in his pulpit telling people what a friend we have in Jesus and about bringing everything to prayer. His example's very poor. And so leadership is about being an example. I would say this here, that whenever it comes to leadership, even on the church board, even in the ministry, if we do not have confidentiality, well, we don't make a very good leader. It would be better not on a board. Because a board sometimes, as a Sunday school maybe sometimes, there'll be issues that will affect maybe the teachers in Sunday school. There'll be issues that will affect the church. And mind you, if you cannot discuss things with a board, and if you were somebody on a board and you went out and said, well, do you know what all we're talking about tonight? You'd be better never ever to sit on a board. Never ever go down that route. Don't go down that route for a moment. Now, there's some things, of course, even in the prayer meeting, where we'll say, well, if we're praying about something, that, well, if anybody's really interested in it, they'll be in the prayer meeting to hear it. They certainly will. But what I want you to get is with leadership, there's responsibility. You imagine what kind of a leader it would be If I was to sit in your house and you tell me something sometime, and you go down the street and somebody says to you, well, I was talking to the pastor, you know what he told me, this, that, or the other thing? You ever hear that? You come to me. You come and ask me whether I said it or not. That's a very good starting point at times. Well, with leadership, each generation must trust God to provide them with necessary leaders. You see, Israel was a very odd nation at this point of her history. She's basically nothing more than a collection of 13 tribes. There's no capital, there's no police force, there's no central government, there's no king, there's no taxation system. What held the tribes together was their allegiance to God and to God's law. But the elders wanted Israel to look a little bit smarter and to have a king like the other nations. And so Samuel sets out and he warns the people of the cost that's going to be involved. He says that under a king, there's going to be taxation. You're going to have to start paying your taxes if you want a king, he says. It costs a lot of money to keep a king, and so the king's going to take your money. A king will need a court and a court officers, and they'll all have to be paid. He says there's going to be conscription. It takes a lot of labour to maintain a royal house and an army to protect it. And so he says these are some of the things it's going to cost you. He says he's going to take your fields, your vineyards. It takes a lot of food to feed a royal court. And the last thing the king will want to do is pay for his food. Now, I heard on the radio some years ago now, and I listen to a lot of these programs, but I'm out in the car while I listen to debate or something, but it was all about the Queen. And everybody was phoning in how well the Queen looks. And somebody phoned in, I thought it was very valid. They said if they were getting her money, they could look every bit as well. They could give a nice little wave to the people every bit as well too if they were getting her money. And so there was a cost was going to be involved. They're going to take the vineyards. He says, and 6 times in 6 verses, they're going to take. In fact, the monarchy will be so oppressive, the people will be virtual slaves of the king. There wasn't very many generations was going to pass until people like Ahab was on the throne. You remember that Ahab one day, he spies his neighbour's vineyard, Naboth's vineyard, he wants it. Naboth says, my vineyard's not for sale. I have people and my children and my grandchildren. It's going to be passed down to them. But this old King Ahab, he says, I'm going to have it. And so he kills Naboth. It was going to cost. Within weeks, Naboth was dead and Ahab had his vineyard. In spite of Samuel's arguments against having a king, the people refused to listen. Their minds were made up. And so what does Samuel do? Samuel withdraws from the people and he sits before God and he says, God, I want you to tell me what to do. Do you ever face a situation where you'll have to sit before God, just on your own, and say, look, God, will you tell me what to do? And sometimes we're in a hurry, but God's not in a hurry. And so we get frustrated. We have to wait sometimes. And God speaks to Samuel. And God says to Samuel, look, let them have their king. It's going to cost them dearly. Let them have it. I was reading a little thing. I jotted it down the other day. I would be very careful if God answers yes to all our prayers. Be very careful. You see, the children of Israel, they cried unto God, and we're told that God gave them their request, but He sent leanness into their souls. They're going to settle for something less than the very best that God had for them. You see, they would not listen to Samuel, and God says, Samuel, listen to them. Give them their king. God is going to give them what they want. You see, everything comes at times with a sting in its tail. You see, what happens is every time they cried unto God in the past, God sent them a leader. But when they cried out for relief from a bad king, verse 18 tells me, God didn't even answer them. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. That's a very sad time. Whenever God doesn't answer prayer, where God doesn't see the need to answer prayer. He says, let them have it. Let them have it. It'll cost them dearly. Let them have it. It's going to cost them. And God, in fact, disciplined them by giving them what they wanted, which was a monarch. A monarchy that they would come to bitterly regret. That monarchy was going to last for 500 years, and it was going to end in failure. Israel faces its greatest threat. Whenever Israel faces its greatest threat from the Babylonians, and they're going to be carried into captivity, the king is powerless to do anything to save his people. Following the exile, there is no king. Israel never has had a king since. But thank God, the people of God do. And you have a king today. If you're saved, King of Kings, Majesty. You have a king today. Not an earthly king, not an earthly queen. No, but you have a king, a real king. One who is interested in the details of our lives. King Jesus. He's our King this morning. May God bless His word to our heart.